We have a video by Healthy Gamers.
Content planning, responding to emails or social posts.
All right, chat, today we're going to talk about how to stop zoning out. And the basic mistake that most people make is they think of zoning out as a problem to be solved, which it sort of is and we're going to do. But there's one main thing you need to understand.
Yeah, it's definitely kind of a problem. You have to be able to focus on a thing long enough to make it worthwhile, or to do it effectively, right? The notion of jumping around like a social butterfly is not exactly advantageous a lot of the time.
Zoning out is your brain's way of trying to increase cognitive resources. So if we look at zoning out, first thing is that everybody does it. And we do it when we are tired, when we are overwhelmed, when we are bored. So if I'm studying for a test and I feel cognitively fatigued and I take a...
So, I guess the notion of zoning out as opposed to getting distracted, I don't know if those are exactly the same thing, if you would say they're the same thing in any case. In one case you're just kind of, or something like that, versus in another case you're kind of actually jumping to something else.
break or I zone out for a little while. When I zone back in, I'm able to study. The problem, though, is that a lot of people get into this cycle of constantly zoning out, zoning back in a way that's really unproductive. And this is something that I really sort of dove into with a patient of mine who had ADHD that was getting worse. Now, this is something that sounds really common, but is actually very unusual because ADHD is one of the illnesses that should not really ever get worse. And I know that sounds weird, but let me explain. So ADHD is a neurodevelopmental disorder, which means that it is a disorder related to the way that our brain develops. So if you look at the trajectory of ADHD...
So it's kind of locked in place when you're a kid more so?
Over time, someone's brain develops in a particular way. They either have mild, moderate, or severe ADHD. And if anything, as we get older, ADHD should improve. About 1 in 5 people who are diagnosed with ADHD is...
It's a bit of a lexical ambiguity there. Should improve. I'm assuming he means get less severe, presumably.
Kids will end up growing out of it as their brain matures
obviously.
as adults. But I had a patient who came into my office who said, my ADHD is getting worse over time, which doesn't make any sense because ADHD is a disease of how the brain is actually wired. And like we just said, it should be getting better. Now, there are things that can temporarily alter your ADHD if you don't...
I would feel like actually shorts or TikToks would actually maybe be a good example of things that would actually mess with that, because I think I would have seen studies on this thing that type of medium can really mess with your attention span, just because it's like constant dopamine, and if you don't have that, if you have something that comparative to that might be better for you, but doesn't have that type of like that exact cycle of constant rush, constant dopamine, constant whatever, that you might have a hard time focusing on it or something.
Sleep very well, if you just went through a breakup or you're stressed out in some way, sure, we can have temporarily fluctuations, but fundamentally ADHD is a diagnosis that should be relatively static or improve over time. And so as I started working with this person, we tried a couple of different things like increasing his medication, but even if increasing his medication allows him to
throw drugs at the... No, I guess...
focus today.
Maybe there's other things involved. I just feel like as a general rule, like taking more medication is not an ideal solution, perhaps.
It doesn't explain the trajectory of his attention span. And that's when we had to start thinking outside of the box. And we dug into this idea of zoning out. And by the way, if you guys want more of these out-of-the-box solutions, definitely check out the ADHD guide, which is basically like my exploration of things that work for patients that aren't a part of...
You ever see, there's a South Park clip I had seen, where they were talking about how they fixed ADHD back in the 19... whatever it was. It's hilarious. Worth a look sometime.
Standard evidence-based treatment. So as I was trying to figure out what was going on with my patient, I stumbled into something called attention restoration theory. So there's I think a couple of Dr. Kaplan's who sort of made an interesting observation that when we go out into nature, we tend to zone out. So as they started to explore this idea of zoning out in nature, they discovered a couple of important things. The first is that when we zone out, it appears to restore some of our cognitive functions.
Hold on, I'm gonna check this out. All right. Art proposes that individuals benefit from the chance to be away from everyday stresses, experience expansive spaces and contexts, extent, engage in activities that are compatible with our intrinsic motivations, and critically experience stimuli that are softly fascinating. I just realized I've been walking around like a numpty with my shirt inside out. Okay, sorry, unrelated. Compatible with our intrinsic motivations, critically experience stimuli that are softly fascinating. This combination of factors encourages involuntary or indirect attention and enables our voluntary or direct attention capacity to recover and restore. Interesting.
So when I'm studying for a test, like I said earlier, and I zone out, when I zone back in, I'm...
Sorry, it just occurred to me that my face is going to be kind of covering this corner.
able to start working on the studying again. The second thing that they noticed is that when we zone out, we seem to be dealing with unresolved issues. So the more stuff I have inside me, the more likely I am to zone out. Now, y'all may have experienced this in a very negative way. If you went through a breakup or something social is going on or you feel really hurt, you'll notice that when you try to focus on a task, your brain will essentially zone out and you will start thinking about other stuff, right? Your brain will start trying to solve other problems. And that's how we discover what the role of zoning out is. It does these two fundamental things. And some aspects of attention restoration theory have basically been debunked, but subsequent
attention restoration theory, that's kind of interesting. I should look into that sometime.
Research has basically shown us that these two elements are why we zone out. It is a way for our brain to cognitively recover some RAM. So you can kind of think about this like even a timeout in sports, right? So if I'm playing a game of basketball and I take a timeout, I need some time to catch my breath. And when I go back on the court, I'm able to play a little bit better. The second consistent finding is that when we zone out, we're usually dealing with internal and emotional stuff. And when I was working with my patient, this is the way that we approached zoning out. Not that it's a problem to be solved, but we tried to understand that, okay, when you zone out, your brain is trying to accomplish a couple of tasks. And the more that we focus on accomplishing those tasks outside of the way that your brain kind of does it, the better off you will be. Because essentially what starts to happen is we get into this cycle where we're trapped in zoning out. And the way that this works, it's a bit complicated, but this is essentially what we kind of stumbled into. So the first thing to understand is that your mind keeps track of all the tasks that you have to do. That is how it is able to remind you that you need to do something. Now, there's a basic problem here because the more things your mind is keeping...
I'm sorry, I should have more to add here, but I just don't.
...track of, the less cognitive RAM you have to actually solve a problem. And
well, that is actually an important point to be made, that I think quite often, unless, like, if you have some sort of really loud internal dialogue going on, it's best maybe to, like, just take a break from work or whatever and try to figure out that stuff so you can do both of them effectively. Because a lot of time, if I have something going on in my ear and I'm also thinking about something else, it's almost just turn off the earbud, just turn off the music, whatever you're listening to, just turn off the podcast or whatever, and focus on the one thing until you can solve that. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to focus on either of them. All right. And to be fair, like if you're zoning out, as he says, or if you're being distracted by this other thing, it feels like that other thing is kind of almost superseding the thing that you're doing at the time in importance. So maybe you should just take a break, go focus on that for a little bit, and then come back and you can actually be efficacious in your duties.
what's happening with my patient, and this may resonate with y'all, is let's say they were working on 5 tasks, one of which was a personal task, which they didn't even think of as a task that they were trying to solve. They had gone through a sort of a breakup, or they were on a break, they were on a separation. They'd been on a separation for about a month, and they were like not sure exactly what's happening in this relationship. They weren't sure if they should move on or they should wait or whatever. And so anytime they're sitting down for a particular task, let's say they're focusing on task number 1, their mind gets tired, right? Because it has all of this stuff in the subconscious, and then it switches to task number 2. But then our mind starts working on...
It's kind of weird that it feels like computers are like a really great example for a simile of human experience to some extent, how they function, how they... there seems to be a lot of, similes you can make there, in any case, where you can compare one to the other and it almost makes sense in your head or something. I don't know. Maybe we're more like computers than we think. Just a really, really fancy biological computer. Now, to be fair, I don't know how much I believe in the notion of AI, or that we're going to create something that's actually sentient. Just to clarify.
Task number 2 for a little bit, and then it gets tired, and it switches to task number 3, and then...
I guess, sorry, with reference to what I was talking about before, AI, etc., I tend to think we're more of a multifaceted creation than perhaps we know, and there's maybe stuff that's mystical / magical / out of sight a little bit, unseen, perhaps more so. So yeah, I'm not confident in our ability to actually produce something that's like a workable sentient creature.
As it starts working on task number 3, it gets tired and it switches to task number 4. And then as they are moving between tasks, eventually thoughts about this separation...
You wonder, what governs the prioritization of, if you're being tired to whatever task it jumps.
...that they're going through will always creep up. So they were sort of existing in this place where even if they spent an hour working, they didn't actually get anything done. And this is when we discovered a couple of very common principles that they had tried from the productivity, podcast circuit, actually seem to be sabotaging them. The first is people will say, just get started. And if you just get started, that's the most important thing. And the second thing that people will say is that, okay, you should just take small steps. Just take small steps, just take small steps, just take small steps. But what we actually found was that just getting started and...
So just on the face of it, both of those seem to be good things, but I guess in this particular scenario, maybe it's not.
Just taking small steps ended up with them sort of taking a couple of steps over here, and then they'd get distracted, and a couple of steps over here, and then they'd get distracted, and they would spend an hour trying to just get started, and they would get started again and again and again, and do a tiny little thing again and again.
So I guess that's the problem a little bit. It just feels like if you have some sort of unresolved thing going on in your head, either find some sort of job where you can actually do both, where it's very simplistic, and you can actually work on this other thing while you're doing it, but don't do anything super complex that will conflict with that. Right? Just do one or do the other. Don't do both. Don't try to do both at the same time. You're not going to be able to. Just thinking there's a saying from Parks and Rec or something. Never half-ass two things, whole-ass one thing or something. A little bit vulgar, but it applies here, right? Don't try to do two things ineptly. Try to do one thing well, in a way that brings it to a reasonable solution. Anyways, that is why Zoning Out is a Hidden Skill by Healthy Gamers. You can check that out if you want.